Hello, this is Rhonda Ferree. I'm an Extension Educator in Horticulture covering Fulton, Mason, Peoria, and Tazewell counties for University of Illinois Extension. In this training module, I'm going to cover general garden care activities that the gardener should consider when growing food in backyards or in community gardens. We'll also discuss how you, as the community garden manager, might take steps to accommodate these activities for your gardeners. For example, you'll need to provide a water source, obviously. You might also provide a place to dispose of waste and plant debris. And in some cases, community garden committees also create specific rules for various tasks, particularly those that require chemical application. So we're going to look at those a little closer. These are the topics I'm going to cover in this module. These activities help a plant grow best after it's established in the garden. And note that I'm covering general care garden topics here, and Extension Specialist Michelle Weisbrook will be covering pest management of weed, insects, and diseases in another module. So I'm going to go through plant care, we'll look a little bit about thinning, containment, watering, fertilizing, talk a little bit about compost, and then end with harvest and storage. So let's get started here and look first about how to space and thin your plants in the garden. It's important that we do that because vegetables give better yields and are easier to manage if they've been given the proper space to grow. When you seed directly into the garden, the seed is typically sown a lot thicker than the final recommended spacing, since actually not all seeds are going to germinate. So we want to make sure we have enough out there. And it's easier actually just to sprinkle several seeds as you go along, depending on the size of those seeds. However, after they start to grow and after those seedlings have emerged, it's important to thin the plants to the proper spacing, or else the excess seedlings can create competition. It's kind of similar to if you think about how weeds can compete with the plant for nutrients, water, and space, so they can actually compete with each other if they're too close together. As a bonus though, as you're taking these extra ones out, you're going to have some tender baby vegetables that maybe you can use. So here you can see carrots, and they were planted really close together, which is how we do carrots. And then we're going to thin them out so that those carrots have room to grow and get larger and become a large carrot that we're used to. But as you can see, those little baby carrots that we took out might be enough that we could add to a salad and use in our kitchen. So let's look at a packet label here, a seed packet you can see here, and it talks about spacing and thinning on the seed packet itself. Not only does the proper spacing assure that the crop develops best, but it also allows for air circulation, which is going to help with maybe some of the pest problems later, particularly some of the diseases. If you use transplants, you actually put the actual plant in the garden and not just the seed. You're going to look at how to space those plants on the plant label that comes with those transplants. But when you're seeding directly in the garden using a seed packet, then look at the seed packet and it's going to tell you all this information. So in this example, you can see that the seeds are placed 1/4 inch deep and had about 6 seeds per feet, and that's just a gauge. You don't have to be specific, but just kind of sprinkle them in. And then after the seeds have emerged, and it shows here that you're going to merge in about 6 to 10 days, you're then going to thin them so that the strongest plants are all about 6 to 12 inches apart to give this plant plenty of room to grow. And then that's going to really assure that the plant can reach its final height, which you can see here is 3 to 5 feet high, and probably that width as well, so that it has room to grow. It will have proper space, to grow if you have them all thinned apart. The excess seedlings sometimes pull easier as you're pulling out those extra ones. They pull out a little easier if your soil is slightly moist, so consider that. However, if you're pulling them up and you see that you're actually disturbing the other plants that are around it, the plants that you want to keep, you may be pulling too much of their roots out or maybe pulling them out a little bit, you can actually just remove those excess plants with pruning shears or with scissors. And I find that that's actually sometimes the easiest way to do it. They're not going to regrow, they're really small, and so you're just going to cut them off, and then the roots that are left will die back, and all you'll have is the plants you want to keep. You can see that this crop up there in the upper right corner, that this crop is going to take 55 days to reach maturity before we can actually begin harvesting this particular crop. The next section in this module, looking at how to care for your garden, talks about how to contain your plants. So tall and climbing plants, for example, can benefit from some type of a containment structure. You can see here that these are actually plots for children. It's a youth garden. Each kid has their own little garden, and they can plant plants that grow up the trellis at the back as well as other plants in the front. A structure for climbing plants is going to allow them something to grow on, but it will also keep some of the taller plants from falling over. Your community garden might have rules about this, about what type of structures they can use in your location. There's various reasons for that. Your rules might also include what type of materials the structure can be made of, or what its maximum height might be. If we think about it, vertical gardens are an advantage in that you can grow more produce in less space because you're going up and not always out. However, a tall structure in one garden space can shade the adjacent garden and influence how those crops are growing. So sometimes accommodations for tall vertical structures might be made so that they're out on the edges of the garden or in a place that won't impact the other gardens around it. Each garden's different, obviously, so do what works best for your garden space. Let's look at some different types of containment structures. The first one you see here are fences and trellises. You can see that this is actually both. It's a trellis that has fencing on it for the plant to grow on. Fences and trellises can be used with various crops, including pole beans, cucumbers, or squash, and it's going to support them as they grow. Varieties that produce fruit that's really heavy, like maybe weighs more than 3 pounds, are probably going to need an extra support on that structure. If the crop is really heavy and it grows when it really develops, it can pull that structure down. So sometimes that heavier fruit you can put into slings. Example of a sling might be a mesh onion bag or maybe pantyhose, something that gives that plant, that crop, room to grow as think about a zucchini, for example, as it gets bigger, or a watermelon. That's a better example. As it gets really big, it's going to need this support in this bag so that it can grow into that area. But that bag or that sling is going to need to be secured to the structure very carefully and strongly so that it won't pull the structure down as well, or the vines down. As the fruit grows, it's not going to pull those vines down, but it will fill in that sling device. To help reduce the weight problem of large fruit on vertical structures, however, maybe the better option would be to grow varieties that produce smaller fruit. So we have dwarf varieties, even, for example, of pumpkins or of watermelon, that make really small fruit. They don't make really large fruits, so that they are better for growing on a device like this. In this example, you can see cucumbers, and those are planted on either side of an A-frame trellis. And cucumbers, when they're harvested properly, usually don't get really heavy, so you just allow them to grow up. Notice in the back of this picture, in the very back, you can see a chain link fence. And that chain link fence is used in this garden to keep out deer, which was eating too much of their crop. Instead of fence, netting can be used to create a climbing device. Netting works well strung between stakes, on walls, or with the fences and trellises we just looked at. The netting, like you see here, has big holes. They're about 6 inches maybe across. There are also nets that are much smaller mesh, and those are used to exclude insects and birds that might damage or eat your crop. Some plants will actually grab the trellis network, like the mesh net you see here, and climb on their own. Maybe they have little tendrils like a pea does. But others may not need to be secured as they grow up the trellis or that netting, and you can secure them with a soft tie of some sort. Sometimes rags that are torn into strips work well for that. Cages and stakes are probably the most common way that we support tomato plants. They're actually called tomato cages. Here you can see tomatoes grown in those store-bought tomato cages on the right. And these cages are actually also supported with a stake because in this case the cages were not heavy enough and the tomatoes were pulling the cage over, so they had to stake it as well. On the left is a special net structure that is the gardener's trying out to see if it will work, and you kind of pull that netting up as the plant grows with it. Cages can also be used for other types of vegetables. I've used them for peppers, for example, and just really something that you want to keep it from flopping over too much in the garden and gives you more space. So as the garden manager, you might supply these support structures for the gardens, or you could at least provide a space to store them until they are needed. The types of structures used to contain plants are endless. There are lots of options, and some of them can be really fun for children. So on the left, you can see a teepee used for pole beans, cucumbers, and passion fruit. And on the right is a recycled satellite dish. And they've actually used the satellite dish as a little children's playhouse, and it's actually covered and supporting the lemon cucumbers in this example. Watering is very important, obviously, and you're going to need to have a water source in your garden, and that's going to be important to produce a high quality crop, or sometimes to produce a crop at all. Although rainfall is a good source, probably the best source of water, as we all know, there are times during our summers that can get really dry, and dry periods during the growing season when you're going to have to water and give additional water to your crops. So we want to look at how to do that properly. There are many ways that you can provide water to your community garden grounds. The best option is, as you can see here, a dedicated faucet that's located within or near the gardens. If that isn't available, water can be hauled into your garden in a large tank. Rain barrels come in many shapes and sizes, for example. They may come from 40 to 300 gallons, even larger. And rain barrels, a community garden could use a rain collection system that's large enough to meet their watering needs and develop it for that purpose. Newer sustainable approaches are also available that use plant-friendly gray water from a nearby building as their water source. Or others in certain situations might use a dedicated well or pump water from a nearby pond. Be sure to always check your local rules. Obviously, in some of these sources might not be permitted in your particular municipality. And obviously, when using municipal water, make sure you know how your city water system works. Some have water restrictions during certain times, and you obviously need to know how the water bill works. And sometimes during drought periods, they will have limitations on the water you can use. So in drought periods, often you're going to need a water use plan. New transplants and seedlings often need more water to get started. So when they're first getting going in the spring in the garden, make sure you monitor those very closely. Once established, however, most vegetables and herbs need about 1 inch of water a week, and that includes both rain and irrigation. However, when gardening in really sandy soils that don't hold water very well, or maybe during a heat wave in the heat of our summer, or during a heat wave and a drought period combined, those plants may need up to 2 inches of water a week to grow and maybe even to survive. And so the really best way to determine if a plant needs water is to get your finger dirty. You're going to stick your finger down into the soil about 1 to 2 inches, just kind of all around that plant. And if that soil is dry, if it's bone dry, you really do need to water, obviously. When you decide to water and give it supplemental water, make sure that you soak the area thoroughly. And you can see here I'm saying to a depth of at least 6 inches. Don't just lightly sprinkle only the soil surface, because that's just not going to give enough water for that plant to really do any good. After watering, check the root area again with your finger and make sure that you watered the soil deep enough. And after a while, you get used to how to water and how much to put on for a particular area, and you might not have to do that step as often. Water needs to get down into the root zone of the plant, which is the point of watering to the depth of 6 inches, because those roots are going to need that water to do the most good. Let the soil dry out then again before you water again. So the soil needs to dry out between, or it could be too wet and can actually sometimes drown the plant. Plants grown in containers, however, are going to probably need lots of water. Containers dry out really quickly and often need watered every day or maybe even a couple times a day during the heat of the summer. Here's some watering tips, and to help your gardeners practice good water stewardship, you might want to post some of these friendly water use tips. Encourage your gardeners to use mulch, for example. Mulch not only controls weeds, but it holds the moisture in the soil and reduces the soil temperature fluctuations that can harm plants and help them. They won't grow as well. There are lots and lots of different types of mulches. Here you can see cardboard that's used beneath straw. Other types of mulches, and again, there are so many different types, and you can be really creative sometimes with this, but there are other types of mulches that are going to be covered in the pest module of this training series when Michelle goes through the weeds portion. Though it's difficult for most working folk, and I really understand that because they get out there at night when they have time, it is best to avoid watering too late at night. So water early enough in the day or in the evening so that the moisture on that plant can dry off before the dew appears. And this can be really important for some of our diseases that like that moist night air. Reduce your water use by directing the water where it's needed most. It's going to need to be at the roots, and so we can actually direct the water there, and I'll show you an example here on the next slide. And as we discussed already, you need to make sure that when we do water, that we water thoroughly and infrequently. So here's a couple of examples. A community garden might limit the types of irrigation systems that are allowed and how they are used. Gardeners can be really creative, and it's actually kind of fun sometimes to see what they come up with, but you might have limits on what you will allow. Here's two different examples. The one on the left is a drip irrigation. It's a very efficient use of water. So it places the water through these tubes you can see here right at the root zone. The water is moving through those tubes and drops right into where the plant needs it. It's not going to be watering the space between the rows. It doesn't water the leaves where it's going to evaporate away. It's only going to go right where the roots need it. In addition, since the foliage is not wet, that can help with some of the disease problems that could like that moist soil or that moist leaf area. The other way to do this, besides using this fancy kind of elaborate system you see here, is simply to use soaker hoses. And soaker hoses are available and work really well for this as well, too. The picture at the right shows a hose sprinkler. And after hand watering, hose-in sprinklers are probably the most common way to water a garden. And there are different types of sprinklers in all different shapes and sizes and that will work for various gardens. And so you can see this one is actually watering the garden itself. It does water the leaves above, but we're watering it and not the grass. Though rare, sometimes individual plots being watered by different gardeners at different times. Instead of doing that, you can actually, as the community garden manager, choose to water all the plots at once at a specified time. So you kind of have a group watering system. The different options are available. Plant nutrition is essential for optimum growth and yield. So in fertilizing, we want to make sure that we decide on a fertilizer source, and gardeners need to know that there are lots of different types of fertilizers, but you might only permit certain types in your community garden depending on lots of factors. There are both synthetic and organic fertilizers that are available. And it's real important, as with any chemical, that we follow the product label instructions for rates and frequency and how often, of course, that we need to do those applications. Here you can see some synthetic fertilizers. These are manufactured artificially. That's the bulk of the fertilizers that we see in the store are synthetic types of fertilizers. They contain specific nutrients that are needed by the plant. And so they may be a complete fertilizer and provide all of the macronutrients that a plant needs. On the picture here on that green bag up in the upper left, you can see kind of in the middle of the green bag, it says 9-13-7. That is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that fertilizer is providing. Some of the fertilizers might also provide some micronutrients such as iron or manganese, or contain a chemical that will change the pH of the soil, as you can see here. Organic community gardens might not allow synthetic fertilizer, so you might have a limitation on some of these. You have to decide that in your rules. Organic fertilizers are derived naturally from plants or animals. Those that are from plants might be compost, and we'll talk a little bit about compost later. It could be cover crops, and cover crops are covered in another module. You could also have organic fertilizers that are animal-based, and those might be blood meal, and you can purchase these, or fish emulsion. Or you might have a source of manure from various types of animals. You can see here, obviously, chickens, which are becoming more and more popular even in urban situations. Please refer to the Planning and Planting Your Garden module of this training series for information on using these cover crops and manures in the garden. And you can see I'm trying to really stress this because there is a real safety concern if we use too fresh of manure that contains some poisons and toxins in there that can move into the food. So food poisoning has occurred from eating produce grown in fresh manure. But don't worry, there are ways to let that manure age, and then it will be fine for use in your garden. So again, check that Planning and Planting Your Garden module for more information. All the work you've done and all that you've spent caring for the garden is going to be worth it when you harvest and eat those fruits of your labor. Ripening and harvest times are going to vary between the different vegetable types. Tomatoes can be left on the vine until they're fully ripened, or tomatoes actually can be taken off when they're partially ripe and put on a windowsill or on a picnic table or something to mature fully. Other crops, though, won't do that. Things like winter squash and watermelon are not ready. You cannot pull them off the vine and sever them from the vine until they're fully developed. They will not continue to develop on their own later. This website that you can see I've got listed here gives some specific information on when to harvest various vegetables. So go there for information on specific vegetables, on carrots, tomatoes, squash, all of those, beans, and learn what you need to do and when you should harvest those vegetables. Some types of community gardens may need some strict harvest guidelines to prevent disagreements. We want to think that doesn't happen, but it does happen sometimes. So if you have a communal garden, be sure that your guidelines are going to state how the produce is going to be shared. And I've seen a lot of community gardens that work well with this, that they create some type of a sharing system and it works for them. If your individuals, though, each have their own garden plot, which is a really common community garden design, you need to make sure that they keep their garden harvested, actually, and to help, ask someone to harvest their plot if they're going to be out of town. Obviously, we should never harvest the neighbor's plots without permission. You might set up a sharing system for the surplus produce. Sometimes these crops can produce a lot of vegetables, more than our family can need. And so you have a system for sharing that surplus. And maybe it's setting on a picnic table in the garden or on a table or in an area. And then people take it on a first come first basis. Or maybe you set up a system so that you can take that surplus to a local food pantry. Make sure you celebrate your garden successes. One way to do that is to host a garden party for all the gardeners, and maybe if you have volunteers at your community garden. It's a great way to build the community. That's part of the community garden. They can also share ideas at that time, obviously taste new foods. That's always fun. And really, we're going to make new friends along the way. So celebrate those successes. At the end of the season, after the harvest, there's still work to be done. So to be sure that happens, your community garden rules might provide some end of season guidelines. And let's look at some examples. We might want to remind gardeners to remove the remaining plants after they've finished harvesting. And that's, the cleanups of the garden area. So you might have some cleanup deadlines. So note those cleanup deadlines and what time that they're going to need to remove all maybe synthetic materials, maybe it's the cages, for example, as well as plant debris that is left there in the fall as it gets ready to go into winter. And you may have guidelines for that. In addition to the harvest party, you might have gardeners meet to discuss the season and what worked and what didn't, and make notes and begin planning for the next year. It is a good idea to provide a location for those gardeners to place their garden debris and waste. And here you can see is a compost bin. That's a really great way to have a place for the gardeners to put their surplus plant material. You could require gardeners to remove and discard of all waste off-site on their own, and that's a good way to do it. Or you might make provisions for dealing with the garden waste and the plant debris on site, like this. You also might need to arrange for garden and recycling pickup of non-plant types of waste, the bags from the fertilizer or the plastic containers that the transplants come in the spring. You could create a common compost bin to dispose of that plant waste. It's important to remember that legally in Illinois, our plant waste cannot go into our landfill, so we need to have some method for disposing of that material. Compost bins provide a location for the plant waste to decompose into a very fertile soil amendment that the gardeners can use the following year. Check with your municipality. Again, check with that municipality because sometimes they do also have compost bin guidelines. For example, some do not allow bins over a certain size. Some might require that compost material be enclosed, like you can see here, rather than just simply piled on the ground in an area of the garden. So if you need more information about composting, we have a really good website, as you can see here, at our University of Illinois Extension home composting site, and then you can get more information on how to compost and exactly how that works. After removing the debris and waste, some gardeners like to till their plots in the fall. Other gardeners don't like to till. They may opt for a no-till method, and both have pluses and minuses, of course. So these are both discussed in more detail in the Planning and Planting Your Garden module of this training series. So go there to learn more about the benefits and of both of tilling and no-till methods. We have lots of more information on garden plants and how to grow for them on our University of Illinois Extension horticulture website that you see here. You'll find information on growing herbs, vegetables, fruits, and so much more on our site. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to go visit our horticulture extension website. Thank you so much.